Let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this next session. Again, we'll begin with a short meditation, just focusing on the breath for a little while, particularly emphasizing this relaxation. We've seen already a little bit in the previous session that part of our strategy for not only dealing with anger and attachment, but sort of preventing it a little bit is this idea of mindfulness. And so through this practice, it's going to really help us to strengthen our mindfulness. And then we'll do, after meditation, a short review of some of the main points from the last session. And then we'll introduce what's called the 3 poisons. This is now pointing to the second of the Noble Truths, the underlying cause of our suffering. Why are we stuck in this state of dukkha or suffering? That these 3 things that poison our mind, which we'll look at. And then we'll look at how these poisons, how they lead to our suffering. That's called, there's a 6-step process. And then we'll also start to look at what's called the 6 factors leading to anger and attachment. These are 6 things that can contribute to anger and attachment arising in our mind. And if we can identify these 6 factors, then we can start to deal with each one of those. So we'll look at those as well in this session. But let's start with meditation. So find a nice comfortable posture. We'll do a short meditation here. This will help us to strengthen our mindfulness, this particular practice. As always, we begin with preparing the body. And so letting go of any external distractions. Simply allow your awareness to descend into the body. And simply become aware of sensations throughout the body. And using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. Softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. Mouth and jaw, soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes, soft and relaxed. And in this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen. happily releasing them. Releasing them into space. And simply allow the mind to come to rest. To come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. And then from that stillness, start to notice the sensations of the breath. Simply notice any sensations in the body associated with breathing in and breathing out. Just notice the breath in the body. Allowing the body and the mind to both be very relaxed. Gently noticing the sensations of the breath throughout the body. And if you get distracted from the breath, the first thing to do is simply relax. Then release the distraction and very gently return to noticing the breath. So each time you get distracted, simply keep coming back to the breath again and again, patiently and happily. We can bring the meditation to a close. So just a short review from last session before we move on. So we saw there that what we all share in common is that we all want to be happy and we all want to be free of suffering. And it often seems like that the source of our happiness is out there in the world, and also the source of our suffering is out there in the world. And so one of the main strategies we tend to use to try to find happiness and overcome suffering is we simply try to manipulate the things around us. We try to attract people, places, and things that seem to be the source of our happiness, and we try to push away or avoid people, places, and things that seem to be the source of our suffering. And this process of attachment and aversion, trying to attract pleasant, avoid having aversion to unpleasant, this strategy in Buddhism is called the 8 worldly concerns. The 4 things on the left we're trying to get because they seem to be the source of our happiness. The 4 things on the right we're trying to push away or avoid because they seem to be the source of our suffering. But we saw there that no matter how hard we tried to use this strategy, we never seem to find happiness and we're always encountering suffering. And we saw here there are a number of reasons why this approach is very problematic. One is that the happiness we're chasing here is a stimulus-based happiness. It's transient, it's temporary. Stimulus finished, happiness is finished. It's unreliable. We have very little control over the things around us, and these pleasant experiences are not really even in the nature of happiness. All that happens is we end up with attachment to pleasant experiences. And usually together with that attachment comes fear and a worry and anxiety about not getting it, not getting enough of it, losing it, frustration when we don't get it, overindulging when we do get it, getting upset when we lose it, dissatisfaction, disappointment when things are not living up to our expectations, and we just simply end up craving more and more. And then we end up losing enjoyment for the things we used to like because attachment is never satisfied. Attachment's always looking for something bigger, better, and different. And actually that was very highlighted to me many years ago when I did my first long meditation retreat. I was in a retreat cabin in Spain up on the side of a mountain in a retreat center. They were providing meals, quite nutritious, but same menu pretty well every week. And we know from our own experience, even if it's food we like, if we get it even a few days in a row, our mind goes, oh, not that again. Give me something different, please. But my experience was after about a month of eating this food, it started tasting better. And I thought, oh, cook must be putting more spices or herbs or doing something. I thought, but then another couple more weeks went by. After about 6 weeks, it kept tasting better and better. And I realized this is exactly the same food as 6 weeks ago. What had changed? What had changed was that due to being in meditation retreat, my mind was calming down, my craving and attachment was subsiding. And I was actually enjoying the food more because of that. And I can honestly say at that time, I've never enjoyed food, any type of food, that much ever before in my life, ever. And also I was on the side of a mountain, a nice little cabin, and the view was spacious, Mediterranean in the distance, beautiful view. But again, if we go to somewhere where there's a beautiful view and we're there for a few days, we don't even notice it anymore. It's just like, oh, okay. The view kept getting more and more beautiful. And then also little things like tiny little flower after some time. Wow, that's so beautiful, so amazing. So this was my experience. So if we really start to reduce our craving and attachment, I think you'll enjoy simple pleasures in life much, much more than you do now. So attachment really destroys our enjoyment of pleasure. And the flip side, we have aversion to the pain, and that pain, all that does, that aversion, is it magnifies our suffering, as we saw with the pain study example. And so here we saw that from the Buddhist perspective, we're simply looking in the wrong place. The source of suffering and happiness is nowhere out there. It lies within our own mind. And so therefore, we need to understand that, because if we don't, we'll continue to suffer. Just like if we don't understand we're physically sick, we'll continue to suffer because we think, well, that's it, you know. But here, the Buddha, in his very first teaching he gave after enlightenment, was the Four Noble Truths, which is a foundation of all Buddhist traditions. And here the Buddha's like our doctor. He's diagnosing what condition do we find ourselves in. We're in this condition of suffering or dukkha. And again, remember, the word suffering here doesn't just mean unpleasant physical, mental painful experiences. It's much broader in meaning. And at the deepest level, the word suffering here means that our human existence is such that there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. It's always there, this all-pervasive dukkha. Why? Because our mind is contaminated with what we get, the mental afflictions. We're going to talk now about these three poisons. As long as they're in our mind, there's always a potential for suffering to arise. But of course, the Buddha's prognosis was very good. He said we can achieve a healthy state, a cessation of all suffering and its causes. And the medicine he prescribed was the truth of the path. What practices do we need to engage in to achieve this healthy state? And we'll touch on briefly some aspects of that tomorrow afternoon when we're looking at the long-term strategy. So now we'll move on to the second noble truth. What is the underlying illness that is leading to us being in this state of suffering or dukkha? And here the Buddha identified two things: mental afflictions and actions. And so we're going to look at that now before we go on to looking at anger and attachment specifically. First, mental afflictions. This word mental affliction is a translation of the Sanskrit term klesha. And a klesha in Sanskrit is defined as mental factors that cause the mind to become agitated or disturbed. Sometimes this word klesha in English is translated as disturbing emotions or afflictive emotions. But I think this is a bit misleading. Because actually in Sanskrit, and also I believe in Tibetan, there is no word for emotion. It does not exist in the Sanskrit and Tibetan language, the word emotion. And I think the reason is that here we're talking about what's driving our behavior rather than the emotional displays at the surface level. That's not the important thing. It's what's underneath that. So that's the level where Buddhism is addressing. So mental afflictions are addressing this underlying dynamic of what is leading to often our very emotional displays. And when we talk about mental afflictions in Buddhist psychology, you can talk about many, but the sort of standard extensive presentation is the 26 mental afflictions, what are called the 6 root mental afflictions, and the 20 secondary mental afflictions which come out of those. But all of those can be condensed down to 3 main mental afflictions called the 3 poisons that poison our mind. And they are ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And the third one, aversion, there is often listed as anger, because anger is a very strong type of aversion that gets us into a lot of trouble. And that's why we're focusing on anger. And those of you who are a little bit familiar with the story of the Buddha can relate to these 3 poisons, because in the story of the Buddha, as he went out to search for the truth and he started meditating under the Bodhi tree there, as the story goes, as it's taught historically, then this demon called Mara came, because Mara could see that the Buddha was, well, not yet Buddha, but this Prince Siddhartha could really cause a lot of problems for him, so he didn't like that. So this Mara demon came to him and tried to, stop him from doing what he was doing. So first, the story goes, he sent his beautiful daughters to seduce the prince. And of course, he just ignored them and they just sort of vanished. And then he sent his army to sort of attack him, and all the weapons turned into flowers, and that was lost cause. And so then the Mara himself tried to convince the Prince Siddhartha he was not doing the right thing, and he just didn't listen to that. And so then Mara just disappeared. And so what we can understand from that story is that the Mara, the daughters, and the army are not real things out there, but they are three inner demons that the Prince Siddhartha vanquished. And these three inner demons are exactly these three poisons: ignorance, attachment, aversion. So Mara is ignorance, attachment is the daughters, and the army is the aversion. So these are the three inner poisons that Prince Siddhartha overcame to achieve enlightenment. So what I'd like to do now briefly, before we go on to talk about the two other poisons of anger and attachment, which is the main topic for today and tomorrow, is talk a little bit about ignorance, because we're going to address that tomorrow afternoon when we look at this long-term strategy. So very briefly here, ignorance in Sanskrit is avidya. So vidya means to know, and is negation, not knowing. But ignorance or avidya is not simply not knowing, it's an active misknowing. So in general, ignorance is defined as a deluded state of mind that is confused about its object. So that's ignorance in general. But here in the three poisons, we're talking about a very specific type of ignorance. We're talking about an ignorance that is confused about the nature of reality. It's an active misunderstanding of the nature of reality. And we have a number of distorted views of reality. And there are four in particular that Buddhism addresses, four of which, each one of which causes us a lot of suffering. The first distorted view we have is we tend to see things which are changing as unchanging. This is the idea of impermanence, that everything's changing. But you might say, but I know everything's impermanent because science has proven it. I accept that this cup, for example, is changing moment by moment. I know that, I accept it because science has proven it. So I don't have that distorted view. But here, distorted view, we're not talking about intellectual knowledge. We're talking about instinctive. So even though probably all of us in this room intellectually accept everything around us is changing moment by moment, including our body and everything, we know that and we accept that, but is that how we relate to things? Or instinctively? I mean, don't we instinctively tend to feel this is the same cup that was here yesterday, it'll be the same cup here tomorrow? I mean, that's how we relate to things. That's a distortion. And because we're not relating to them as they exist, that creates problems, mental afflictions and suffering. The second one we've already addressed. We tend to see pleasure as happiness. Pleasure is happiness, attachment, and all the mess from there. So we see how that distorted view really gets us into a lot of problems. And the third one is the idea we see where there's no self, a self. This word self, we have to be very careful when we hear about or in Buddhism, because the word self can be used in at least two different ways. Sometimes we're talking about self versus others. Then we just mean myself and others. So that self, of course, exists. We exist. But generally, when we see the word self in the context of a discussion about nature of reality, we're not just talking about self versus others. We're talking about a false sense of self, an overinflated sense of self. And here, we're talking about this idea that there's an autonomous me here, meaning instinctively, we feel like there's three things here. There's a body, a mind, and a me. Three. And we have that in our language. We say, I have a body, I have a mind, as if there's a body, a mind, and then a me that sort of stands apart from the body and the mind. That's we grasp onto. That's how we think we exist instinctively. Again, intellectually, we could, not so difficult to understand, that's not a correct way of seeing ourselves. But instinctively, that's often how we see ourselves. That's a distorted view of reality. That leads to all a big mess. But at the deepest level, and this is the one we're going to address tomorrow afternoon, is we tend to see things which are dependent as independent. Again, I think many of us, probably all of us in this class, at least at some level, intellectually accepts the idea of interdependency. You know, I think science has gone a long way to show how things are interdependent. And at some level, I think all of us would accept that intellectually. But is that how we see ourselves in the world instinctively? I don't think so. I mean, instinctively, it seems like there's an independent objective world there and an independent subjective me here. And that's a distorted view. And that is at the deepest level the thing, this is the Mara of ignorance in our mind we need to overcome. And we'll look at how we're going to do that tomorrow afternoon. We'll spend the last 2 sessions looking at that. So that's the long-term strategy. But let's now go to the other 3 poisons, because that's the main topic now for the rest of today and tomorrow morning. And that is anger and attachment, or often aversion and attachment. But again, here, often instead of aversion, we have anger listed as the 3 poisons because it's a strong type of aversion that gets us into a lot of problems. So here, this word anger is a translation of the Sanskrit term pratiga, and this is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive, it exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and thus wishes to harm the object. Why does anger wish to harm the object? Because anger believes that object, which could be a person, is the source of our suffering. Attachment, in Sanskrit, raga, is a mental factor that sees its object as attractive. It exaggerates the object's attractiveness and thus wishes to possess and hold the object. Why? Because attachment believes that object is the source of our happiness. So what we see here in both of these definitions is this factor of exaggeration, of distortion. And this is something also commonly understood within psychology. In fact, I've got a quote here from one book from His Holiness Dalai Lama where he says, "Recently, a psychotherapist told me that when we generate anger, 90% of the ugliness of the object of our anger is due to our own exaggeration. This is very much in conformity with the Buddhist idea of how mental afflictions arise." So again, we can see that, and we know this well, this factor of exaggeration and distortion. And we know that well from our own experience, particularly when we have very strong anger or very strong attachment, we're not really seeing things very clearly. We completely exaggerate and distort things. So that's very briefly how they're defined. Before we go on to look at anger this afternoon and attachment tomorrow morning, how to deal with them, what I'd like to do now is see how, from this distorted view of reality, this ignorance, how does that lead to attachment and aversion or anger? And how is that driving the whole process leading to this current situation we find ourselves in, suffering? Because if we can understand this process, then we can then, at each one of those steps of the process, we can do things now to stop that process or reduce it, to reduce the effects of it. So by understanding the process, then we can understand it, these various different points, what we can do actually right now to at least reduce our anger and attachment and reduce our suffering. So at the first step, we have what's called seed of ignorance. So again, here this word ignorance, I'm talking about it very specifically. This ignorance that sees there's an independent me here and an independent objective world out there. And seed means habit, and we have this habit. This is, again, not intellectual, instinctive. We have the instinctive habit to see things in this way. And when we look out on the world, then everything that appears to us seems to exist there objectively, completely independent of us. What in Buddhism is called dualistic appearance. there seems to be a subject-object duality here. And according to Buddhism, these appearances are deceptive, that things do not exist in this way. So this sort of appearance is called mistaken dualistic appearance. There appears to be subject-object duality, independent me, independent world, but this is not how things really exist. And because we have the habit of believing that, we never question appearances, because there's no reason to question appearances, because things have only ever appeared to us in this way. If we ask anyone else, everyone else will agree with us. Yes, it also appears to me like that. So there's no reason to question it. So we never question it. So we end up at step 2. And again, step 2 is just actively seeing ourselves in the world in this way. Again, this is not intellectual, instinctive. So instinctively, we're seeing me here, independent world there. That's step 2. Every experience we have, in every experience, there's a mental factor called feeling. And here's another classic example of how terminology can be confusing. Because when we see the word feeling, we automatically think emotion. Here, the word feeling does not mean emotion. Feeling, the Sanskrit term is Vedana. And Vedana is simply experiencing things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And we can do that either mentally or physically. So often when we talk about physical experience, instead of feeling, it's translated as sensation. Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral sensation in the body, or pleasant, unpleasant feeling in the mind. So again, when you see the word feeling in Buddhism, it does not mean emotion. It's simply experiencing things as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And that's there in every experience we have. So for example, let's say I'm looking at this cup here that appears to exist independent of me. I just accept that. So I'm at step 2. But let's say when I see this cup, I'm having a pleasant experience. That pleasant experience, together with the belief that that cup exists objectively there independent of me, will naturally lead me to assume there must be some attractive quality there that's causing my pleasant feeling. So we'll see this cup as inherently attractive or objectively attractive. Or if I'm having an unpleasant experience when I see this cup, together with the belief that that cup exists there objectively, we'll naturally assume there must be some unattractive quality there that's causing my unpleasant experience. So we'll see it as inherently or objectively unattractive. Or if it's a neutral experience, inherently neutral. So that's step 3. And of course, what Buddhism is saying is nothing is objectively attractive, unattractive, or neutral. So this is actually a misconception. So that's step 3. So now we got to step 3. Then step 4 easily follows. Because again, if I'm having a pleasant experience when I see this cup, and I then have this misconception that this is not intellectual, it's just instinctive. We're not like thinking about it, it just happens. And I'm instinctively seeing that this is objectively beautiful, that beauty's there, then of course, that seems to be causing the cause of my pleasant experience. I like pleasant experiences. I want pleasant experiences. I want that cup attachment. Or if I'm having an unpleasant experience, then I don't want unpleasant experiences. I don't like them. That cup seems to be causing my unpleasant experience. Get it out of here, aversion. Or if I'm having a neutral experience, that will simply reinforce my mistaken belief that that exists objectively, which is ignorance. But here at step 4, we often see, instead of the word ignorance, confusion. But here confusion isn't like, is this a cup or not? It's confused about how it exists. It's just another word for ignorance. So we see here at step 4, these 3 poisons, the 3 core mental afflictions that arise based on whether we get a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral experience. These mental afflictions, these 3 poisons, lead to all the other mental afflictions. So all other mental afflictions either come out of one of them or a combination. These mental afflictions are driving our behavior, and every action we do based on a mental affliction, the Buddhist assertion is, has a result, has a consequence. And the results of our actions are our experiences. And our experiences collectively, the Buddha used the word suffering to refer to that, dukkha. So this is how, from a distorted view of reality, this leads to these two main of the three poisons of attachment, aversion, or anger. This is driving our behavior, and this is leading to the situation we find ourselves in. And so by understanding this process, we can understand two things, or many things actually, but primarily two things. One is, if we want to overcome suffering, step 6, we have to go right back to the beginning, step 1. It means we have to get rid of our distorted view of reality. That's the long-term strategy. And that's this idea of, in Buddhism, this idea of emptiness, come to realize there is no independent me, independent world. And we'll look at that, what that is and how to do that tomorrow afternoon, the last 2 sessions. But also what we can understand from these 6 steps is, what can we do at each one of those steps right now to at least reduce the impact of the process, to at least reduce the suffering that we maybe experience. And so that's what we're going to be starting to look at this afternoon and tomorrow morning. Some more short-term strategies for dealing with anger and attachment, practically right now. And so here, this process is very nicely summarized by a great Indian master, Nagarjuna, from the 2nd century. He said, by extinguishing actions and mental afflictions, there is liberation. So by eliminating the underlying cause, the mental afflictions and actions, we can be liberated from suffering. And then he says, actions and mental afflictions arise from misconceptions, and misconceptions arise from elaborations. And here the word elaboration is another word for ignorance. And then elaborations or ignorance will cease through cultivating emptiness. So he's telling us how to overcome suffering, how to achieve liberation through cultivating this wisdom of emptiness, this vipassana practice of emptiness that we're going to look at tomorrow afternoon. Actually, before we move to the next topic, any questions about this process? Because we're going to be looking again at this process tomorrow, but if there's not something not clear on it now, yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for your time and your teachings.
Sure.
I wanted to understand, how can we develop detachment to our attachment, in the sense that how can we be detached attached, in the sense that when I see a pleasant thing or an object or a person or a situation, intellectually I know that everything is happening on the inside, but it's more like a trigger for me to have these experiences on the inside. Having known all of that, how do I sort of get detached from the outside thing?
Very good question. The question is about attachment and how do I become detached from these things which I'm attached to. This I'm going to talk about in some detail tomorrow morning, but a brief answer now that you've brought the question up is, actually these are the 2 extremes. The 2 extremes are attachment and detachment. So in Buddhism, of course, we're talking about giving up attachment. And people then mistakenly think, oh, then I have to become detached. But actually that's the other extreme. So, and again, it really comes down to a little bit the terminology, but basically, and this is sort of what we do now, we tend to be stuck in these 2 extremes. Generally, most of us are caught up in attachment, and then we see it's causing so much suffering, and we don't know how to deal with it. So what do? We cut. We become detached. We cut. But is that a healthy state? Absolutely not. That brings a whole lot of other problems. So detachment is not a solution to attachment. So we're not talking about, when we talk about getting rid of attachment, we're not talking about becoming detached. We're talking about being able to be fully present without attachment. So the middle way is what's called non-attachment. Non-attachment. That's not the same as detached. That's the extreme. But that's unfortunately sometimes a misunderstanding, because for us there seems to be two choices: attached or detached. That's it. Nothing else. And so when we see that attaching is just causing us so much suffering, and Buddhism says you need to get rid of that, we think, okay, I need to become detached. And then of course people disconnect from everything, and then they suffer even more often. And they think, well, this Buddhism doesn't give me any answers, but that's not what Buddhism's saying. So there's a middle way between those two extremes, and we'll look at that in more detail tomorrow morning.
Yeah, I stayed a longer time in Myanmar for Vipassana. And then I noticed monks are also me. I was not allowed to laugh, to sing, or, to touch each other, everything.
Sure.
How you feel about this?
Okay. She said she was in a monastery in Myanmar, and there the monks and participants weren't allowed to touch anything or do anything. The reality is that, and this actually in Buddhism, the world we live in is called the desire realm for a reason, because the main driving force in our life is desire. And here the word desire is synonymous with the word attachment. We have craving and attachment. That's the driving force in our life. And not so easy to overcome it, to have this idea, well, if by next week, I think I can overcome my attachment. I think this is completely unrealistic. So it's a lifelong thing. We'll need to work on reducing our desire, our attachment. And again, we'll talk more about this tomorrow morning. But again, a brief answer here is that because we so easily get caught up in this and get overwhelmed, as long as we find ourselves living in an environment where we're just getting overwhelmed with craving and attachment, we have no space to develop ourselves, to calm our mind, to do these things. So one strategy, it's not the only strategy, but one strategy that we can do is to temporarily step back from all these things. Of course, running away from these things is never a long-term solution. But maybe as part of an effective short-term strategy, step back from them a little bit, i.e., you don't have to become a monk or a nun, but that's what effectively monks and nuns would do, is they would step back from that stimulus to get yourself in a supportive environment where then you can really meditate and develop the mind and start to overcome them. Then we can step back out into society and not get overwhelmed by them. But of course, again, just running away from all these things that's the idea of detachment. We just need to run away. Well, that's not a solution. But stepping back temporarily can be helpful from that. And I'm going to talk more about that this afternoon and tomorrow as well.
But they do this lifelong.
Yeah, again, because for us, to be honest, this will be a lifelong endeavor. Does that mean we have to become monk or nun to do this? No, absolutely not. But what we need to remember is historically, in, for example, ancient India, ancient Tibet, most people were illiterate, struggling to survive. If in those days, if we wanted to follow a spiritual path, what could we do? We're just struggling to survive. But in those days, there was monasteries and nunneries, and you go there, they look after you, they feed you, they clothe you, they educate you, and you can be in this supportive environment for the rest of your life to develop yourself. So historically, there was a lot of advantages to becoming a monk or a nun, because the other option was impossible, nearly. Whereas in the modern world, that's not the case, because now we're generally literate, we have a lot of things available to us, and so forth. And a lot of the advantages of being a monk or a nun historically often don't exist in the modern world either, because now if you want to become a monk or a nun, usually there's no monastery or nunnery you can go to, and you'll need to financially support yourself. And then you, of course, in the modern environment, wearing these robes, you also get a lot of negative feedback. So it's quite challenging in the modern world. But historically, there was a lot of benefits. Because often people mistakenly think, oh, if I really want to follow this path, I have to become monk or nun. That's completely wrong. For some people, still in the modern world, it may be the best way. Might be. So we need to see, well, which way is best for me to follow a spiritual path? So yeah, that's the answer, basically. Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me? I think my question is related to aversion and anger. Like you said, intellectually we know and understand like this is happening. I kind of struggle, of course, in the integration part of it. I feel like, the challenge is now that I know that I feel aversion to my anger.
Aversion to your anger.
I feel, why am I angry? I know, like, maybe it's an exaggeration of my interpretation of the situation.
Sure.
And I'm getting more irritated by it.
Sure. Okay.
And then I just feel like I'm in these, the meditation we do about clouds, like these are thoughts, and I'm like getting lost in it because I feel like I'm intellectualizing too much and I'm trying to integrate, but I'm getting lost in the words.
Yeah. Very good question. This is about, once we start to understand these processes about anger and attachment and so forth, then it gets frustrating because we know, but somehow we can't change. And this is why meditation in general, but particularly cultivating mindfulness through meditation and integration is so critical, because as long as it's an intellectual idea, we'll just be frustrated because we think we got the answer, but nothing's changing. And the reason is our behavior is not driven by our intellectual understanding. It's driven by instinctive habits. That's the reality. So as long as it's just an intellectual idea, then not much is going to change. In fact, we could be the smartest Buddhist scholar on the planet and be completely miserable. What we need to do is bring it from here to here. This is why meditation is so important, to really internalize, to come to experientially see things this way, not just intellectually. If we don't make that move, then it's going to be a struggle and we won't really make much progress. But the more we can bring it from here to here, the easier it becomes. So more I'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay, last topic before we break for lunch. And they are what's called the 6 factors leading to anger and attachment. In fact, these 6 factors are leading to any of the mental afflictions, but we'll put anger and attachment because they're the 2 we're focusing on in this course. So these are 6 things that can contribute to anger and attachment arising in our mind. 3 of these are necessary. You must have the first 3 for anger and attachment or any mental affliction to arise in our mind. The second 3 are 3 other ones that can make it even more contributing conditions. So what are the necessary causes for anger and attachment to arise in our mind? First is seed or habit. So seed here means the seed of the mental affliction. Like for anger to arise, we need the seed of anger in our mind. And we all have the seed of anger in our mind. For some of us, that seed is very strong, meaning that only needs a little stimulus and we explode. For some of us, the seed of anger is quite weak, so it takes a lot of stimulus before we get angry. But we all have the seed there. Without that, it's impossible to get angry. So that's we can see as part of the long-term solution to get rid of those seeds of anger, and we get rid of them by this wisdom practice of emptiness. The second necessary cause, there must be an object. Without an object, anger attachment can't arise. That object, of course, can be external or internal, and often it can be that we're not really aware of the object. Anger arises and we go, what's happening? The object's there appearing, but we're not aware of the object, but it's there. So we need an object. And the third thing we need is what's called inappropriate attention. We need to be seeing that object in not a correct way. And there are many ways of doing that. The one we briefly touched on just now was that, again, if I'm having a pleasant experience, the inappropriate attention would be to see that the beauty is there or the ugliness is there. That's one example of inappropriate attention. And of course, in the modern world, I think advertising and marketing prey on this inappropriate attention. They make us, through advertising and marketing, make it even more, so we end up buying things that we don't really need because they say, wow, this new iPhone, it's so fantastic, it'll do everything for you, you're going to be much more happy if you have this phone, blah, 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 blah. And then we go, oh yeah, I need that. And then we have attachment. So that's also inappropriate attention. So we need these three things. We need the seed, we need the object, and we need to be seeing it in a wrong way. And then affliction can arise, like anger and attachment. But there are three other things that can contribute to anger, attachment, and other mental afflictions arising. The first is what's called familiarity. Familiarity here means that if we allow, for example, anger to keep coming up in our mind, if we don't stop it when it comes, maybe it's only small and we go, oh, it's okay, I just feel a bit irritated, so it's okay, I'll let it go. I'll let it continue. The more we do that, the more familiar we become with it, the easier it is for it to arise. So that's familiarity. If we simply allow anger to go unchecked, then in future it's going to be much easier for it to arise and probably much stronger. The second one is society. In the text, it often talked about misleading companions. And we see this very well. We are very easily influenced by others. And so society, people around us can really contribute to all sorts of mental afflictions arising. But not only people, but the media. In the text, it often talks about false teachings. I mean, now we see so much about media, and usually, again, it's sort of media that's trying to, get us to buy things that we don't need, or they've got an agenda and they're just, throwing things on social media which are completely false, causing us to get upset or angry about some issue that's actually, they're just making it up. So we can see how, particularly in the modern world, these are big impact on us. So if we can understand these 6 factors, we can look at each one of them and see how can we reduce the effect of that on us. And that's going to be these points we're going to look at now in the context of anger and attachment, how we can work with these and reduce the impact of all 6 of these factors. So in fact, here we have C very briefly, and then we'll break for lunch. The seed of anger we can only get rid of by eliminating the ignorance. That's the long-term strategy. Object, as we mentioned already, what we can do as part of an effective short-term strategy is if there are things in our life, and it could be people or places or things, that whenever we come into contact with them, they always overwhelm us in a negative way, then step back. Of course, running away is never a long-term solution, but as long as we continue to go into those situations, we're always getting overwhelmed with attachment, aversion, anger. We need to step back, give ourselves some space. Inappropriate attention, we can investigate this exaggeration, distortion. And we'll look at how we can do that, particularly tomorrow afternoon. And then familiarity is, even if it's a very small craving, attachment, or anger or frustration, don't let it continue in your mind. Cut it short. Because the more we allow it to continue, the easier it will be for it to come up again in the future. And again, society and media, again, like the object, avoid harmful people, avoid negative media, step back, give yourself some space. Because if we can do that and develop ourselves, then later we can enter into those more difficult situations and not get overwhelmed. In fact, what you'll find is as we progress in the spiritual path, we'll start to need to go into those difficult situations that challenge us to go further. But as a beginner, we don't need that because it's just too much for us. So as a beginner, step back, work on ourselves, and then gradually we can move into more and more difficult situations and not get overwhelmed, benefit, and then hopefully benefit others as well. So that's all I wanted to mention. Any questions before we break for lunch? Yeah.
So my question is, how do I know that I'm not escaping the situation and just stepping back? Because I see sometimes people are in that safe bubble, and rather than working on themselves, it gets like a comfort zone for them, and they prefer living there for the rest of their life. So that is also a form of escapism, right?
Sure,
So how
absolutely.
how can I be honest with myself in such situations?
Again, I think we can. How do we know when we're stepping back, we're not just running away? So again, I think it's like we can check our motivation, you know. And it comes down to a little bit when we look at this view of reality, difficult situations, what's our perspective? Because now, a difficult situation, we tend to see it as a problem, obstacle, aversion. But if we can understand the source of suffering is not out there, then instead of seeing the difficult situation as a problem, we can see it as an opportunity. Because actually, if we look at our life, when were the times when we most developed as a person? Not when things were going easy. When things were easy, we just sort of float along, not really doing anything. It's only when we're challenged that forces us to do something, and then we grow as a person. So if we can sort of make that shift, that difficult situations being opportunities, that will avoid this going the wrong way. And then within that, we can see this is an opportunity, but actually it's too difficult. I can't really take advantage of this opportunity now. Let's step back so later I can take advantage of this opportunity. So I think if we can make that shift, problem versus opportunity, then we can avoid this just running away. Any other last question? Otherwise, we'll break for lunch there. Okay, let's break for lunch. Oh. Coming? Question? Or maybe we can do the question after lunch.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So we'll keep that question that someone's typing, and we'll do that.
Yeah.
We'll do that after lunch.
Sure.
Okay. Let's break for lunch. We've got an hour and come back at 1:30, and we'll start to look now then at anger and how to deal with it. I mean, first define it, where it comes from, and how to deal with it, and even how to prevent it a little bit. But let's take a break for lunch.